Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar that's being hosted by the Northeast Ohio Area-Wide Coordinating Agency. My name is Kate Menning, and I manage community affairs for the agency. And I'm going to just get started really quickly here with a few housekeeping items. And the first is that this platform has the option to turn on closed captioning and language translation. So you can find these in the Zoom control bar, either by clicking on show captions or interpretation respectively, if you need those apps. All attendees are muted today, and the chat function is disabled. So if anyone has a question that they'd like to ask of our panelists today, you can type it into the Q&A function. We'll be going over those questions after the panel discussion as time allows. So overall, we do hope that today's webinar will provide a platform for discussion and on workforce mobility and the effect on business growth, development, and job retention. So right now, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's forum, Bashara Addison, who is the Director of Workforce Innovation at the Fund for Our Economic Future. And Bashara is also a member of NOACA's Community Advisory Council. So welcome, Bashara, and thank you for being here. I think you need to unmute, Bashara. Bashara, are we having some technical difficulties? Is there any way I can unmute her? No. Okay. While we're waiting to see the technical difficulties are fixed on Bashara's end, I'd just like to go ahead and introduce today's panelists. Our guest speakers today are Ben Capel, the Chief Executive Officer from Lake Tran, Michelle Rose, the Chief Executive Officer of Greater Cleveland Works, and Molly Schnoke from the Center for Economic Development at Cleveland State University. So, welcome panelists. We're very happy that you can be here. I want to mention again to all of our participants that if you have a question at any time during the panel discussion, you can put that in the Q&A function, and if we have time, we will get to those questions. Bashara, are we able to unmute? How about I ask all of our panelists to unmute real quick, just so we can make sure everything's working well on your end.
Hi, this is Michelle Rose.
Hi, Michelle. Nice for you to be here. Thank you.
Ben Capel reporting for duty.
Okay. And Molly?
Hi, Molly Schnoke. I'm here and present. Just as a test, though, I can see on my screen Bashara is showing up with my name and using that link, so I don't know if that might be causing any complications.
Okay, well, I see Bashara signed in as herself, and also when we did our test earlier, seemed to be just fine. So something may have occurred that is just causing this issue. So, but in the issue in the just and for time purposes, maybe we can go ahead and get started on talking about some of the questions that we had related to workforce mobility. And to just set the stage, we know that workforce mobility refers to the ease in which workers travel geographically between jobs. So as distance between work and home expands, transportation is increased, and those critical components to those employment options and employee retention issues are important for both our commuters and our employers. And there are also measurable costs to these work commutes. Whether you're driving, you're taking the bus, you're biking, or you're walking, commuting takes time, and it also costs money. So employers recognize that for the most part, and that attracting and retaining talent in this area is influenced by those transportation options. Hello.
Hello. Can you hear me now?
Oh my gosh, we can hear you, Bashara. Thank you.
Perfect. For some reason, I could not unmute. And we already did our sound check, so I apologize.
No, it is not. There's some fluke, and I very much appreciate you taking the time to work out that issue. I'm going to let you just go ahead and take over because I know you had some really great points you wanted to make before we got started. So
Yes, I do. And thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today. This is such an important topic. No matter what we do, we know that when it comes to workforce mobility, that we have to work at the intersection of multiple systems, and that when our systems aren't strong, or when we have to deal with the fragility of those systems, that we often run into a situation where workers are going to struggle. One thing that we talk about at the Fund for Economic Future is how we think about distance discrimination. And distance discrimination is a term that is used to apply when policies and practices, whether intentionally or not intentionally, create barriers for workforce mobility. And it often happens where, when we think about historically, workers from certain parts of our community are deeply disconnected from being able to connect with the kinds of jobs that we know that individuals are capable of doing, particularly when we think about national policy that has really built out the Federal Highway Administration and caused sprawl where jobs are no longer directly connected to people. And so, with that said, there's a couple things that we want to be able to talk about today. First, transportation isn't about getting just from point A to point B. It's about connecting talent to opportunity. And in Northeast Ohio, we see how mobility challenges can create barriers or accelerate opportunity. And we know workforce reliability is dependent on not just transit, but also the multitude of options that help people move from one place to another. And in this historical moment, we're also witnessing some generational shifts with workers. Incoming workers, particularly this younger generation, they don't actually see driving as essential. We have young adults not getting a driver's license for financial, environmental, or even lifestyle reasons. And we know that being able to think about having a diverse network of transportation options then becomes more critical than ever. We've already kind of mentioned, we had the introductions of our three very capable panelists who offer really unique perspectives to these challenges. But I'll start off again with saying the first is Ben Capel. He's the executive director of Lake Tran, who understands firsthand how transit systems connect communities to economic opportunities. The next is Michelle Rose, who's the CEO of Greater Cleveland Works, our Cleveland Cuyahoga County Workforce Development Board, and she works directly at the intersection of workforce development and barrier removal for individuals who are looking to get to work. And finally, and certainly not least, we have Molly Schnook, Director of the Center for Economic Development at Cleveland State University, and she is going to bring a regional and data economic development insights to our discussion. So over the next 40 minutes, we're going to examine how our diverse transportation network that includes walking, biking, transit, can open doors for job seekers and give employers a competitive advantage in attracting talent. And we'll also discuss how these practical solutions provide proven strategies and partnerships that we know can make a difference. And so you'll hear some of those highlights. So we'll also look ahead and think about what is the highest priority for improving workforce commuting in our region, and what solutions can make the biggest impact now, and maybe even a little what are some policies and practices that are hindering our ability to actually make that possible. And we'll end with something actionable. We want to ask, what is the first or small step we could take tomorrow? And we'll begin with the first question on the kinds of things that we can do. And so we'll jump right in. And the first question is around job access. And so as we think about the opportunities that might be available for workers, if the three of you could jump in, and I'll ask Ben to start off first, really discussing what you see as some of the access challenges workers might be facing in the region. And also, if you have some testimonials or stories on how businesses might be working through some of those challenges, that would be helpful too. Ben?
Yeah. So, well, thanks for having me. I think that, the average worker in our region um, sometimes struggles with finding access to a good job because of, like you mentioned, where they live, what transit or vehicle options they may have. The cost of everything is going up. So even if you have a car, it can be hard to use that as part of your daily life. And so those people that live next to good transit or in a good area with a lot of jobs just have easier access. So breaking those barriers down can be hard. Sometimes it means you can spend more time in the commute process. And communities that have better transportation networks can have better employment opportunities. And so it's certainly important that we as a region think about, how the whole network works together, not just cars and highways and, transit, but like biking and walking and how all those things play together to really get, access as a whole to employment. I think that's really important for us to, keep focusing on.
So, Michelle, I'm hoping that you can talk about what are some of the unique challenges in a couple different areas. One, are there distinctions between industries and how workers get to work? And then, Molly, I'm also hoping you can talk about how mobility options differ by geography. Michelle?
Thanks, Bashara, and thanks everyone for logging on today. So yes, challenges on getting to work do differ by industry and occupation. So an example of this would be healthcare workers who work a night shift or who don't work traditional hours might not have access to public transit when their shift is over or when it begins. Another example of an industry-specific challenge is in construction, because construction sites are temporary by definition, and because they tend to be in new places where public transit might not yet reach, you often need a car to get there. And so we know of construction employers who require that their employees have a car. And there are other times where public transit or innovative ride sharing models could fill that gap, but that takes a lot of time and intentionality from a system and from an employer to make that true. The one thing I'll say is we know that regardless of sector, that being late to work doesn't work for most people. Most employers cannot tolerate lateness, rightfully so. Obviously, they need workers there when they need them there. And there's also a huge intersection, which I think we'll talk about along the way with childcare and how a drop off to a childcare site really further complicates getting to unusual shift times for workers who are parents.
Thank you, Michelle. And Molly, if you can speak to how there are really some differences in where you live and how you access transportation. And also, I'm hoping you could speak a little bit to also what are the different types of mobility supports needed at different stages of people's lives. Can you jump in and talk to that?
Sure. So, yeah, first, in thinking about geography, I mean, you mentioned distance discrimination, and we tend to think that about that as originating in the core and outwards, but that really applies to geographies across our region or any other region. And so, Northeast Ohio is made up of the urban county, rural county, semi-rural, right? And there is not a uniformity across our own region, our own economic region around access and how you get there. I mean, Michelle talked about not at the right times. And so if you are, coming in, maybe you have the skills and the ability to get a position maybe at the Cleveland Clinic and at the downtown campus and a really well-paying job, but you live out in Ashtabula County and maybe you can't get there. And maybe you can't yet afford a vehicle to get to that job until you have that job, right? Sort of that chicken and egg. And so geography also really plays a role in our mobility. And I think we have to think of our mobility across our region and across our economy as not just even being main thoroughfares, but how do you navigate the whole of the region? And how easy is it for folks to navigate the region? Then you brought up, Bashara, about different stages of life. And we tend to also think about that mobility related to workforce as being maybe sort of a stagnant period of time, right? Or like in stasis where everything is sort of the same. And you're going to need different access to transportation and places that you're going to need to go also at different stages in your both career and life. And so if you can't get to healthcare, as again, Michelle was saying, right, being late or not being able to show up for work, if you can't be healthy and you can't access healthcare, you also likely have a job that might be in peril because you are calling off or you're sick and you're not able to go. And so those kinds of things go hand in hand. And also with childcare, right? That mobility and the ability to enter and remain in the workforce is also dependent on your access to those kinds of things. And that's driving. I'm sure there are many people, right now it's driving. I'm sure there are many people on this call that have experienced the mad rush to get to a child care center at the end of the day and pick up your child before there's, a financial penalty for not being able to make it there on time. And I remember thinking that if I didn't have a car, there would be no way I could ever get to 6 o'clock and pick up my child. And I'd be paying out of pocket every day these extra costs. So there are also these sort of hidden penalties in navigating your community that it is important to take into consideration when thinking about where people live, work, and play out their lives.
No, thank you, Molly. And I'm hoping that you might be able to speak to a little bit about the behavioral economics that goes into workers' choices as it relates to work and transportation.
Right. So think about the childcare example again. Right. And this isn't just a function of I can get a job at a business in Solon. How am I going to get there? Where am I going to place my child in childcare? Is it going to be near work? Is it going to be near home? And in a lot of childcare surveys, ones that we have done in the past as well, and when you ask people their preferences, most people prefer to choose having their child care closest to where they live, not where they work. And so the further you are in distance from where you live to your job also has impactful choice on, can you put your child in childcare? Am I even able to go to work? And so you may not take that job, or that might not be realistic for you transportation wise because you can't navigate back and forth between those 2 points very easily. In addition to that, it's also about taking care of other family members and potentially parents, multi-generational households. And is there only one car in the household? How far can you travel for work if you need to be, back at the house or somebody else needs to have a car? So those are also um, different dynamics that people have to navigate as it relates to transportation that impact their job choices. But I will also give an example that I think is really telling about this whole idea of mobility. And right now we're talking about physical mobility of driving or moving around the region for work. Mobility, economic mobility, is also it's intersectional, and that means it's multidimensional and multi-pronged. But what you have is economic mobility, so physically being able to drive or reach particular locations and geographic points. But economic mobility is also the ability to move through and navigate the economic system. And so a great example of this trouble that I think touches on both of those points is many of you might be familiar with having seen in the news about Cleveland State University when they temporarily ended their RTA bus pass for students. And there was significant worry and concern on behalf of the students and the university that they would not be able to continue to attend. And students outright said they wouldn't be able even to get to class, they wouldn't be able to get to their jobs as well using this pass. So their ability to access opportunity through education was impeded by their mobility in being able to have the bus pass and get down to Cleveland State. And so thankfully that was resolved, right? But you can see sort of instantaneously, it's not that they couldn't even, run out and get another bus pass. The cost of that was prohibitive for students and really had an immediate impact on their lives. And I think that that's a sort of a great example of how to think about when people think about jobs or a workforce training program, that mobility really comes into play in what they are able to do, even if they are, most desirous of taking advantage of a program or being engaged.
Well, thank you, Molly. And that's a perfect segue into our next question, really around retention and reliability. And so we know even the best candidates can struggle if they can't reliably get to work. But we also know that there's some practical steps and approaches that can resolve some of those challenges. You just gave one, which is addressing the cost prohibitiveness of being for students to be able to get into and from school. So I'm hoping that you all can speak to what can we do to improve employee retention, reliability, and productivity using transit solutions. And Ben, I want to turn this to you first, because I'm hoping you can speak to a program that you help to, that you lead and were able to start around Dial-A-Ride in Geauga County.
So for those that don't know, Lake Tran operates Geauga Transit under a contract with the Geauga County Commissioners. So we have been working to improve the service in their community within the constraints of their budgets and everything. But some of what we've done is, maximize scheduling opportunities that don't require you to call in every day. Paratransit is an amazing service for people that have a disability or that are a senior or need a special service. But even the idea of calling in every day to book a ride can be a barrier to some. And so, especially in the Amish community where, they don't use technology as much as some of us, we worked with their community leaders and some employers to create a paratransit sort of bus stop, if you will, where the Amish can come to and they don't have to schedule in advance. They just kind of show up and we take them to a collection of manufacturers. And it has significantly increased the ridership in the Amish community. It's reduced absences at the employer, and it's just made it generally easier to get to work. And it's a win-win for everybody. The transit system has more ridership, the people have easier access. But sometimes you just have to think outside the box. You have to think from the perspective of the person using the service. And that's what we, have always tried to focus on. And those little changes, it doesn't seem like a big change, but that small change can really impact a person's ability to get to work reliably. And so, with Geauga Transit specifically, that's one change we made to really, help impact workforce availability.
Oh, that's a great example, Ben. And it's also a really good example of where there can be public and private partnerships. And so, Michelle, I'm hoping you can jump in and talk about some of the ways that you think where an organization like yours, which is a quasi-governmental organization, can work with industry to be able to kind of bridge those transportation gaps.
Thanks. Yeah, I couldn't agree with Ben more that oftentimes we're going to find solutions that help people by really listening to the individual person or people, and themes that we see from people on what they really need. So one thing we do very basic, you mentioned quasi-governmental, that means that we receive our funding from the federal government. And of course, that comes with some strings attached. However, the federal government does view transportation barriers as a very real barrier for people to succeed in training and employment. And so we're often able to subsidize bus tickets. But for example, one of the things that we've really worked to try to make easier is instead of needing to physically hand someone a bus ticket, how can we work towards an electronic system where that transfer and giveaway can be not in person, since that's part of the problem. So that's a very basic thing that we've looked at, again, in response to what people tell us in their real lives. Sorry, my Alexa's talking. And the other, though, that's sort of on the other end of the spectrum is with a more flexible pot of funding than our federal dollars, which are called WIOA dollars. We have a separate fund in the Built Environment Collaborative called the Barrier Removal Fund. And with that money, which is for people in construction trades training and employment, we're able to pay for things like car repairs and we can reimburse for Uber and Lyft when necessary, although that's not our main preference. Because so many construction workers, like I mentioned earlier, do need cars to get to work, for us within that pot of funding, it is allowable to reimburse for car-related expenses, including things like driver's license, reinstatement fees and fines, and some insurance costs so that people can use their car to get to work. We're also on the cusp of piloting a program where we're able to co-sign for car loans for people who need a car in order to get to their construction job and don't have a car today, which is a pretty innovative model. I'm really excited to work with HFLA on that. So we are making some progress, but it has really taken more flexible philanthropic and private funds in order to make that happen because of the restrictions around the federal dollars that come to us. So I'm excited about those. There's definitely a role for philanthropy and for the private sector to invest in some of these strategies to get people ready to work.
Oh, that's really helpful, Michelle. And Molly, I'm also hoping that you could jump in and talk about some kind of unique transportation challenges. Michelle just mentioned, getting a driver's license and really understanding how what are the tools that individuals need? I call them enabling conditions to be able to get to work. And one of them is kind of fundamental. And we don't always appreciate how challenging it might be to get some of those things. So, Molly, could you speak to some of the research around driver's licenses and kind of any other barriers that are the essential foundation for being able to take advantage when transportation options are available?
Right. So I think that, what Ben and Michelle talked about also were sort of some programs are pilots, some are larger scale, right? But it's like layering of programs. It's this service, it's a van service, it's helping with this, it's helping with this aspect of it. And I think those are critical. As you mentioned, that there are other financial barriers to transportation in not just owning a car, right? So the state of Ohio just passed also requirements that individuals under a certain age getting their driver's license now are required to spend more hours, in a training driver's education in a vehicle. There's significant cost to that. That's going to be a barrier for individuals, especially younger people entering the workforce, in terms of time, maybe away from a job, and the cost of that. There's also barriers. We talked about at the beginning, younger generations not getting their driver's license at the same rates that previous generations have in that ratio. That's also a function of cost. And when you interview or survey younger people, they tend to say things like, well, I don't have to pay insurance, which is such a significant cost. I don't have to pay the maintenance and upkeep on a car. I don't have to continue worrying about getting, that keeping that driver's license when I don't even ever use it. And there are those additional barriers for employment if you are going to have significant portions of generations that start out even without a driver's license and then are confronted with those costs. And we know that in 2025 and 2026, there's a lot of information out there about the increasing cost of insurance. And that could put even older workers in more significant financial straits because they're paying significant amounts more for insurance as well. So it's not just younger generations that face this barrier, as well as, again, reinstating your driver's license if it has been suspended is a huge barrier for individuals and workers, right? Across a number of industries. So there are all of those elements. But what I also want to say with what Ben and Michelle talked about is, right, so there's kind of this programmatic at this transportation scale, but then there's also at a much more systemic scale about what we can do around making transportation more available, easier to access, that impacts the ability for an individual to get to work. And some of that is already being done in places like Cuyahoga County around model transit-oriented development ordinances for communities. So Cuyahoga County Planning Commission has created TOD templates that communities that are interested in doing so can adopt and use and help as guides to encourage development to occur at nodes of transportation and encourage nodes of transportation to reach to where development already is also, right? So both new and existing. And I think those are also policy elements that we have to really take into consideration as we're thinking about where new businesses might want to locate, where new housing is located, right? Because where people choose to live is also a function of their mobility or where they have access to live and is affordable to live. And so those are all things that I think we have to think about these barriers at every level.
Well, thank you, Molly, for that. And I'm going to transition us a little bit into what we can do about some of these challenges. And so our next question is really around maximizing commuter choice. And we know that the U.S. Federal Highway Administration defines transportation demand management, TDM, as a set of strategies aimed at maximizing traveler choices. And that really relates to basically from a location and a route to how reliable those tools are between a location and the routes that people take. And so my question for all of you is, how do your organizations help businesses become more attractive to talent through commute-friendly policies and infrastructure? And then how can cities and counties collaborate at the regional level to kind of better support worker mobility? And I'm hoping, Michelle, that you can jump in and talk a little bit about some emerging work that you're leading around an employment quality framework, really thinking about what workers need and how we can better inform businesses and create some both carrots and sticks in making sure that businesses are thinking about commuter-friendly policies. So Michelle, can you start off with telling us a little bit about some of the emerging work that you're leading right now?
Sure. So credit where it's due. A lot of this work initiated with Bashara and the Fund for Economic Future coming out of the pandemic, a series of surveys, focus groups, and eventually a report called Where Are the Workers, about why people had left the workforce during the pandemic and what it will take to bring them back. And a lot of really interesting information. from that. One of the largest takeaways I got is people want more training to have upward mobility, which is a different conversation that I would love to have with everyone. But one of the things we also heard is there continue to be transportation challenges for people. That was true before the pandemic, and it's still true today. We are doing a somewhat similar process in terms of the listening sessions with our job seekers who we see at Ohio Means Jobs, which is our job center at 1910 Carnegie, and with our employer customers who come to us to help fill their open jobs. Really, again, listening to what seem to be the challenges, but also what kind of benefits do they offer that might not be the traditional benefits you think of. So, and this is where it ties back to where the workers and what workers want, which is there are many things that make a job good. And one thing we are trying to do is assert what are all those factors that employers might want to consider based on what workers have told us to close the gap between openings and workers who are available. And a hypothesis is that transportation or even more flexible schedules are going to be amongst one of the things that we hear from employers. And so the whole purpose of the employment quality framework process is to assert a definition or a series of factors that might help close that gap and to help employers move closer from where they are to being a high quality employer. And for the high quality employers who are already there or who get there to better market those benefits to workers. So a transit subsidy or a parking subsidy or a RTA pass might all be benefits that employers might consider when they think about when they hear and they better understand and really think about what they can do to attract more workers. So we're very excited about that work, and we will be applying it to our own practices first in terms of how we work with employers to help find new workers.
Well, thanks, Michelle. And you gave some really good examples of things that employers can do. And so, Ben, in the work that you have been leading, both in Geauga and in your entire footprint, I'm wondering if there are any best practices from employers, whether that's an incentive, a policy, or partnership, where you have seen employers really think creatively about how to work with organizations like yours and others around supporting transit options and transit choice for their employees. Can you provide us some examples?
Yeah, so I'm going to include workforce and schools together in this comment, but we work really hard with our community. You know, staying connected to what people need and what people want is one of our primary goals. And we do that by being out in the community. But one of our programs that has been very successful in that area for both schools and workforces is a program we call Transit Go. It was a brainchild of my director of communications. And it is a program where the employers and the schools sign up with us. So we get some information from them. And then at either no or low cost to the school or the employer, their worker or their student gets a free bus pass for a period of time. So we have over 300 employers signed up in Lake County that their employees get free transportation services. And it's a really great program because it connects transit to workers in a way that doesn't normally happen. You know, they have employees that come and they hear about the program, they want a free bus pass, and they go to their employer and say, hey, sign up for this program. You know, normally one of the problems, at least in my opinion, with employers is they don't even know how their employees get to work, and it's sort of not always even in their purview. And so this requires them to understand more about their employees' needs and how they use transit to get to work. And it opens up conversations. You know, it increases the community value for transportation as an asset. And like I said, you know, we have almost every school district in Lake County is signed up. We have over 300 employers, and we have people that, you know, they stay in Lake County and they stay with certain employers because they get that free benefit. And so, yeah, it costs some money. You know, we had a grant program to start it originally, but we've decided to continue to sustain it ourselves because It's just that important of a program. For some people, without it, they can't get to work. But probably the most meaningful part is that understanding from the workforce or the workplace, I'm sorry, about how important different transportation options are to their workforce. And when their employee, who they know, who they have a connection with, needs it, it just becomes more meaningful than sort of the abstract concept that transportation is important. And so it's been really, really great for us, very successful.
Well, thank you for that, Ben. And we're going to touch a little bit more on this idea of real employer listening and how they learn about what their workers really need. So we'll touch on that in a few minutes. But Molly, I'm hoping that you can lift an example of an employer who is really kind of providing incentives, specifically Cleveland Clinic and Case around like residential living close to work and who's able to take advantage of that program. So Molly, I'm hoping you can elevate that example.
Sure, of course. So what Bashara you're discussing is a program called Greater Circle Living, and it's been around for a number of years here in Cleveland. It's supported with philanthropic dollars and nonprofit partners in the University Circle neighborhood area. And it is an example of other workforce, other employer incentives and benefits to, in some ways, retain this job retention idea as well, which is that Case and Cleveland Clinic participating in this program provide a financial incentive in the form of a forgivable loan for purchasing or renting living in the neighborhood. So if you live within a certain geography, about a mile or so around the clinic and University Circle, and you want to purchase a home, you can get a forgivable loan up to $10,000 to help with that. And so it's this idea of live, work, play, right? This it's sort of an extension of that 15-minute city, that everything you need is right around you, but it comes from the employer. And what we've heard in looking at this program and others, right, because this isn't the only one, there are large institutional employers across the country that are also doing this, universities and hospitals in leading cities that are able to get their workers as close to work as possible. That cuts down on employee absences and increases job retention. And so, when we've looked at this, the institutions also use this as an attraction tool. And so for new employees, this is that sort of carrot incentive for them in getting employees, right? It's kind of that icing on the cake. They can say, we can also give you this benefit that helps with making it easier to live in the neighborhood and be closer to work. And I think when we talk about micromobility options as well, that's really important, because right now I see lots of people out there on those e-bikes and scooters, and you go to other cities and you see them all around too. And then you think sort of, in the winter, that dynamic changes, right? So some of those micromobility options might not work, or they're seasonal, they're more reliable seasonally. And so living closer to where you work is one way to address this idea of mobility, job retention, and job attraction as well.
No, that's a really good example, and something that we had a chance to talk about before this panel was that there are some incentive programs that are more attractive to individuals based on maybe their income and geography. And so I'm hoping that you can provide an example of like who's taking advantage of some of these what I think about like anchor institution strategies around transportation. And I think it's really powerful that you're lifting up the intersectionality of transportation, housing, and then you also mentioned childcare earlier, that they're all really interdependent. And when you're thinking about benefits or supports for employees, you're thinking about a package, and that package kind of has to include all three because they're quite interrelated. But when you think about incentives, particularly at like Cleveland Clinic, who is taking advantage of these programs?
From what we know, which right now is somewhat limited, and in previous, you can find on our website, we've done evaluations, not of Greater Circle Living, but it was called affectionately Gucci, Greater University Circle Initiative, which kind of predates that. And there was some data involved. So it was across the spectrum. I mean, the program is open to, and generally at most of these kinds of institutions, is open to any employee. The clinic always reported running out of funds to support it, right? They gave a certain budget allocation, and it was always taken advantage of, right? They always ran out of money before the end of the year. But you actually tend to see, in some cases, higher earners taking advantage of that. Understanding that, maybe they're not the ones that need it as most, but they tend to be the ones, and again, higher earners, that's sort of over the average. You see a lot of doctors and hospitals taking advantage of that, as you might expect. You want to be as close as possible. I would want to be if I'm a cardiac surgeon at the Cleveland Clinic and something were to happen. But there are also part of those programs and those incentive programs for employment is if you can get actively recruit residents from the surrounding neighborhoods to be your employee and take advantage of that program, right? You can potentially have more impact on maybe a lower wage position where you're throwing $10,000 towards the purchase of a new home versus somebody who is more apt to afford it. What we found, and what I think you're referring to and that we talked about in this instance is, as an example, the clinic was trying to recruit residents to work in positions at the institution like valets, right? And groundskeeping. But they found that the residents didn't qualify for those because they didn't have driver's licenses. So you can't be a valet. You can't even get into that job at the clinic and then access that resource. So that's in a way where these other challenges and barriers around the whole of mobility also restricted their access to a program where it could have helped them purchase a home in the neighborhood that they lived and taken them from a renter to a homeowner. But they couldn't even get that job, right? You can't be in the facilities and management if you can't drive the trucks around the institution and the neighborhood to move things around a place as big as the Cleveland Clinic or even a university. And so what they found were there were other barriers that they actually hadn't realized. And to Ben's point, it causes them to talk to their workforce, right? These programs have them engaging with their workers around what they actually really need. And so you can then make adjustments to those programs based on that. And I think that that's it's like a complicated example. And at the same time, it's sort of so common sense, right?
Well, I mean, I think you're really lifting that. One, no one size fits all. So when you're thinking about benefits and incentives, different groups are going to need or take advantage of different things. And also that they also can work. It sounds like these programs have also really helped with retention and talent attraction. And so we know the programs work, we know people are using them, and we know that there's no one program that works for everyone. And so you do need to have a diverse portfolio. And so one of the things that NOACA has is Commuter Choice Awards. And that's really honoring and celebrating employers who kind of invest in really good transportation policy and incentives. And so if from the three of you, and I'll start with Michelle first, what advice would you give to employers who are thinking about adopting a portfolio of transit options for their employees?
Yes. So I'm going to start to sound like a broken record here, and I'm sorry, but ask your workforce what they want and need. I think, for better or worse, we live in times where people don't always feel comfortable raising some of these issues, particularly if they're personal or perceived as, uncomfortable, that they might not be willing to speak up and say, I don't have reliable transportation unless they're really encouraged and it's a safe space to do so. But setting up a mechanism to get that feedback from your employees, maybe even anonymously, is my advice for how employers might pursue some of these changes. I'll tell a quick anecdote from my last job. I worked at the United States Department of Labor, which had 7,000 employees at the headquarters in Washington, D.C. And we did a huge effort on employee engagement to increase our rankings of employee satisfaction in the federal government. We were second to last for many years, and we didn't think as the Department of Labor we should have poor job quality. So we really, really dug in with people on what they wanted. And some of the surprises, some of the answers we got were surprising, and that the top two submissions that people sent were one, they wanted a microwave so they could heat their lunch alongside their coworkers who were buying their lunch in the cafeteria. Easy, right? Couple microwaves doesn't cost very much money. But the other one, and this came up a lot, is they wanted a covered bike rack for people to ride to work and then have a safe, both from the elements and from theft, place to store their bikes while they were at work. And again, pretty low cost solution that really mattered to people, not just because they got what they wanted, but because they felt like they were being listened to. And so I would just again encourage you to ask your employees what would help them get to work, to be on time, um, and to make their commute a little easier. And I think we will see that pay off in retention and in satisfaction.
Well, thank you, Michelle. And I know, Kate, you're kind of in the background, but I know that NOACA has some best practices as well. And so, Kate, I'm actually hoping you can jump in and share maybe an example of one of the employers that has won the Commuter Choice Awards that NOACA puts on every year. And also, I know that you have a program that employers might be able to take advantage of right now. And so I'm hoping you can speak to those two things.
All right. Well, I'll speak to the Commuter Choice Awards. Past winners have included Cleveland Clinic, Case Western Reserve. We've had then some smaller, we have a tiered approach to the award process, which includes large employers in both like business and then government and nonprofit, and then smaller employers, so that there's some equity, so to speak, there with the awards process. But the Ohio City Bike Co-op is one of one of our smaller business winners. They recently were highlighted in a media campaign that we had in the last month with a TV station that I am really it was just really exciting to hear about the value that they place in not just the business approach to their support of multimodal transportation, but the perks like, their employees can fix up their bikes there right on site, that they have, access to those kinds of that mobility. There are also, other approaches like the transit passes that I know have been mentioned. That is a very, valuable resource if you can subsidize transit passes for employees that need them. It's a perk for them, and it helps retain them in the long run. But to get to one of the programs that we provide here at NOACA, we have a van pool subsidy program that is really a partnership with we have a contract for services with Commute with Enterprise that provides vans. And if those employers qualify for for our subsidy programs, they can get anywhere between 50 and 80% reduction in their vehicle leasing for those eligible van pools for up to 3 years. So that's a program that's being very well received. We've got over 40 active van pools right now in the region. And what I can do in our response back, we will be sending an email to all the attendees and registrants, and I can put just contact information on how to get in touch with our van pool manager and get started on learning more about the van pool subsidy program.
Well, thank you, Kate, for that. And now for our lightning round to get ready to close us out of this panel. And that is really thinking about, if you had a magic wand, what solutions or policies or programs do you think can make a difference right now? And what are the levers needed to make those happen? And I know we only have a few minutes, so I'm hoping we can have kind of a lightning round of responses. And I'm going to kick this off with Ben first.
Well, I always think, for most of us, where there's a will, there's a way. So, if we're creative and work together, we can come up with a solution. But if I could pick one thing that I think would make a big difference, it would be, yeah, maybe a heavy lift, but change the Ohio Constitution to allow transit funding, or to allow the gas tax to fund transit funding and not just roads. And, that's a political lever. It's not easy to pull, but that's a weird restriction that most states don't have. So, yeah, that's my lever.
I love it. As someone who loves public policy, you're speaking to my heart. Michelle?
I also love a public policy wand waving solution. That's a good one, Ben. I was going to answer also from a systems response, which is something we haven't talked too much about today, which is transit-oriented development and the prioritization of maybe more walking and biking. I think Molly mentioned e-bikes earlier. I am an e-bike commuter with a cargo, and my cargo is a 7-year-old daughter who I take to school on her e-bike. So, safe streets and the ability for more people to feel like that is a viable and safe option for them would be the ideal.
I know that Molly did mention earlier that Cuyahoga County is thinking about transportation or transit-oriented development. And there's a really good article from IdeaStream that speaks to some of that work. And so when we follow up, maybe we can include that article. Molly, if you had a magic wand, what would you do?
I am going to take a slightly different perspective from a different place in this. And we've only touched on it briefly. We did talk about intersectionality and, where people live and all kinds of other dynamics related to economic mobility. I'm going to say that I believe that more consideration and attention needs to be paid to affordable housing. And when we tend to talk about affordable housing, we think automatically kind of fall back on this view of it being subsidized housing. And that is not the full purview of what affordability is. And by that, I also mean creating or having available housing that is affordable to a number of different types of people, different income ranges, right, across the spectrum. Again, think of like older homeowners, brand new people starting out, because it's really a function of business growth. And so access to housing is as much about workforce development as access to transportation. And those go hand in hand. And that goes to Michelle's point, too, about micromobility. And I think that if we think about more co-locating where we live and where we work, that whole movement through the economic system and movement through our geography will be easier for people.
Well, thank you for that, Molly. And just as a plug, Lorain County is working on a mega site where they just released, I think Monday, it was either this Monday or last Monday, an RFP to do a housing and transportation study, because we understand that if we want to attract businesses of that size that could really take advantage of a mega site, that those two issues aren't divorced from each other. And so we are coming up at the end of our time. I'm sure people have questions, and so you can feel free to email NOACA, and I'm sure that NOACA can also share all of our contact information if you want to continue the discussion. And I just want to thank all of the panelists for kind of offering these really unique and diverse perspectives around transportation options and really showcasing that if there's a will, there's a way, as Anne put it. And I love that. I'm going to keep using it. So thank you so much all for being here and spending your lunch hour with us. And we hope to see you for one of our next forums.
Thank you, Bashara. I really appreciate you and the overcoming obstacles at the beginning here to lead a really, really interesting and great discussion. I also want to thank everyone who stuck till the very end of this presentation and this panel discussion. We will have this panel webinar posted for future reference. And I will be sending out a survey that will be distributed to all of our registrants to get feedback on this forum experience. I want to thank you all again for being here. And Bashara, look, we can see you. That's wonderful. I just want to thank you all again for your great comments and for all the participation that we had from our audience. So thank you again, and you have a great day.